Good morning, guys. This is Anthony here. What I'd like to cover now is the second video. In this second video, we're going to talk about the request library, and then secondly, we are going to talk about conditionals. So after that, we're going to take that request, the response to the request, and we're going to tie in the first piece that we learned about essentially parsing out the responses and getting specific pieces of data out of that response and then doing something with that. So now we get to tie what we've learned together so far. So as you see here, I have a screen of the request library, and the request library is what we're going to be using to make this API call. Previously, there was something called URL lib, and URL lib was much more tedious with how it set the connections up. You can think of it similar to how NetMiko was written specifically for network devices, because Paramiko didn't really handle network devices very well. You could still write a Paramiko call to a network device, but there was a lot of additional overhead required specifically for a network device. So, as you know, somebody had written NetMiko, and NetMiko is much easier to work with if you're connecting to network devices. Same applies to requests. Requests is a easier form of the URL lib libraries. So this is pretty simple. All we're going to do is a GET request, and as you know, GET is just pulling some data from the API, and then from there, calling r.text will give us the JSON response. So I will now transition over here to starting this. So first we're going to import requests, and then as you see here, we're just going to pass in our URL. And I want to intentionally show you what happens if you do not put in the authentication at the end. It's not going to throw a response. And that's because regardless if you authenticate correctly or not, it's not going to throw an error. It'll only throw an error if you can't connect to the API and to the specific URI. So if I were to say r.status code, it shows a 403, and as you know, the HTTP 400 codes is a error, request error. So the question is, what is the response that we're getting? So that will give you just that briefly, but if you type in the text, it'll tell you authentication credentials were not provided, which is obvious. So what you can do is you can put this into a conditional. And the way you do that, a conditional is essentially if this happens or if this doesn't happen, then do this, and then this, and then this. So there's if, elif, and then else. And in this case, what are we going to say? What are we going to do? I would say that if r.status code equals 403, print request error, you need to provide authentication. And then that's it. You don't need to put an else, because if it actually, you could, let me think about that. If you do put an else, then you could say connected successfully. And as you see, request error. So I don't want to type this every time that I do this. So I'm going to show you a more efficient way of writing this and making it super simple to connecting, to where the only thing that you need to get, or the only thing you need to provide, is the URI. So let's start with this. We're going to do something called a function. Okay, it starts with DEF. What is the purpose of a function? A function is essentially something that you write as a, you can think of it as a module, I guess. It's not really a module, it's an internal module to your program. But it's just it's something you can call as many times as you want, and you pass parameters to it. And instead of writing this code multiple times for multiple different connections and calling this multiple times, you just call the function, and within the function it does everything that you write for that function. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I say def, and then you can name it whatever you want. So let's say connect to API, and you have these little brackets here, parentheses, and in the parentheses, this is where you want to pass your parameters. So what is the parameter we want to pass? The parameter is, we want this, we want the URI. So we put a variable here, URI, that'll be our variable. And then within this, we're going to say r equals requests.get URI. And then after that, we are going to say if our status code equals 403, print request error, you need to provide authentication. And I got a little extra space there. Oops. Else print connected successfully. Pulling API response. One other thing that I want to cover here is we're only catching the error if, and technically this is not best practice in how you would write this. Technically you would raise an exception, but for this case, because we're covering conditionals, I wanted to show how to write a conditional. But there is other possibilities of errors that you could be raised. One of them is if you passed a URI, an endpoint that was not valid, then the API is going to respond with another error response code. So if we were to say elif actually we'll say for O not in our status code, or excuse me, not in, it's in status code. Then we're going to say print an error occurred. Actually, and we're going to do an F string here too. Remember the F string, don't forget the F string. An error occurred, the error was our status code. Okay. So now we cover all of our exceptions, but unfortunately at this point we don't really know what that exception is yet. So we're going to tell whoever's using this what that status code is, and then we can adjust that function later if we want to. But for now what we're doing is we're just covering a 403 for the authentication, and then we're covering a generic 400, or whatever the 400 code is for everything else. Then as we figure out what those codes are, then we can raise more specific exceptions. This isn't an exception, again, this is just a conditional. I'm only showing you this because you want to know conditionals. Now, regarding exception handling, I will cover that later, but for now, let's focus on this. So then after we have our three possibilities, and the way that this is ran, so think of this like an ACL. If is your first statement. Elif, if the first one was not met, let's look at the second one. Otherwise, return this was connected successfully, which is not necessarily true because, unfortunately, the other thing that could happen is you could get a 500. Let's say there's a server error. Technically, server error could be raised. So the way that you would want to change this here in Elif is you want to say, you want to be much more generic. So you'd say Elif 20 not, actually, the only thing we should expect from a get is a 200. A 200 is the only good response code by standard design from an API. If we do not get a 200, then something's wrong. Okay, so that's what we're going to write. Everything else, otherwise, we're going to figure this out now. Okay, so now we have our function. The next question is, how do we work with this function? We take our URI, and then we say connect to API URI. There's your URI. Request error, you need to provide authentication. Of course. All right, so now that we have that, the next part that we want to do is we have to pass into the function a option to add our authentication, our API key. So the way that we do that is unfortunately, we're not doing a username password. The way that you pass in the API token is a bit different. You have to put it in the headers. So the headers is an option in the .get, and maybe, let's see here. There's a option to add headers like this right here. So you want to add a headers to the request. So the way that we'll do that is a little differently than you would typically go about it. We want to make this as generic as possible. So when I say that, if we want to have 3 or 4 different possible combinations. So the first possibility is making a request without any type of authentication, which is possible, not for this API, but in general. The second one is we could have a authentication using username password, like here in this location. There's the other possibility to where we're passing an API token into the authorization options. And then finally, you could actually both have authentication and headers, because once we start doing anything that's not just pulling data, like for example, if we were to add data to a specific endpoint to a resource, so like for example, put or post will add information, we're going to need to pass a payload of data into the headers. So what we want to do is we want to have 4 different combinations involved in this. And unfortunately, let's say that you like I said, you want to have the option of adding headers and auth. The problem with this is you have to always input headers and auth. So these are typical arguments. There's something else in a function you can call known as keyword arguments. And the way you do this is you put in your keyword argument and then you set it to none. So you set it to nothing by default. And then it only is used if you ask, or if you tell it a specific, if you give it a specific value for that particular keyword argument. So for our situation, and we can put this in any position we want. We could put auth first, and then we could put headers, or vice versa. That's the nice thing about keyword arguments. So in this case, we're just going to do headers and auth, and then what we do is we are going to we're going to need a few conditionals here, because I told you there's 4 possible permutations. So the first one that we want to cover is if headers and auth. So basically what that means is if headers has a value in it and if auth has a value in it, both of them have to have a value. Okay. And then we say here URI auth equals auth, headers equals headers. So this comes from the library. As you can see, you have to put in auth equals or headers equals, and then you're just passing whatever was provided here. So that's how we handle that one. And then the second one, we could put if headers are equals requests.get URI headers equals headers. And then, oh, actually, this needs to be an elif too, because we're going through, think of this like, if you're a network guy, think of this like an ACL. Each entry, if elif, 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 else, is like an entry in an ACL. It goes through that sequence. If you just start with an if every time, then it's a separate set of sequences. So the next one we would have is if elif auth and then finally, else, the only possible one, other possible one, is we just pass in the URI. Okay? So that's how we want that. Another thing you could technically do is you could take this and replace it with this generic thing here, KeyW_args. So what KeyW_args would do is any of the things that it identifies as a keyword argument. So if you have this variable equals value, if you have that in there, then it's just going to identify every single one of those values implicitly. In this case, I want to show you something more explicit. So we are only allowing specific keyword arguments, because then otherwise it kind of opens things up, and that can be good or bad. Could be bad. So now we have all 4 possible permutations. Technically, I could actually make this much more generic too, to where I could take the verb here, so we have get as our verb, and then I could take that and I could put it in as a argument or a keyword argument. I could say verbs equals and then whatever your verb is, but you'd actually always require a verb, so it would have to be, you could technically default it. You can actually default your options as well to something, but here by default we're just putting in none. So now we have, we're just going to cover get here. That's all we want. So the next thing that we need to take into consideration is this here, this 6 lines of code where you have a conditional looking at the response code of the actual request. We don't want to rewrite this for every single one of these 4 clauses up here. So the question is, how do we work with that? And the way that we do that is by removing all of this. Oops. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a function that sits right above the code, which says actually below get response code, and then we will pass no variables into that. I'm just going to get response. Actually, no, I take that back. We just need R. Let's say that. And what we're going to do is, if that is problematic, we're going to do that for every single one. And as you see, this function does not exist yet. The question is it going to throw an error? No, it's not, because it's wrapped in a function. Until we call this function, you're not going to get an error, as you see. So we're going to make a new function here, and we're going to have to lay this out slightly differently, because the intention is to stop this if we have a problem. So we're going to say get response code R, and then we're going to take all that code from previously. We're going to pass that into here, and we're going to do this slightly differently than what was done before. We're going to raise an exception for these two. And then finally, we're going to have this return a message if it's successful. And if we say not equal to 200, oh, it's because I have this out here a little bit. There we go. Okay. So now we say let's make sure we get a good response code. And we want to make sure we get a good response code. So connect to API, and then we're going to pass in just our URI, which is this. We can actually pass in the URI without, as you know, without authentication. So here we go. Now we have a request error, and it's being raised. It's throwing us this exception back, so it is not completing. And then we have a second exception, but I'm not... Actually, I do know how to simulate that second exception. So before we do that, though, what I want to add is now I want to add the headers. Okay? So I have the headers here. I'm going to copy that, and it's going to authenticate. And there's nothing returned. So that's actually one thing I forgot to add into here. Here in the Connect API, we need to return something. We need to return something. So I think if I still have R being presented here, it still shows up. But I want to return something in the actual function. That's how you do it in a function. You return. Printing is not optimal, because if it's not a text object, then it's laid out slightly differently. So what you want to do is right here, you want to say return R. And then it should return R. And if we call this again, oh, I forgot. Return R.text. And I think I've tried doing pretty print on this as well. And there we go. Now we have our API response. Looks pretty good. Doesn't look as well formatted as the first video. I'm not sure why. We'll not worry about that right now, though, because all we're intending to do is parse this out. So, what else are we missing? Oh, actually, I also do want to show you what an exception looks like. So, an exception aside from the authentication. So, for example, if I get the API URI wrong, an error occurred. The error was 404. Okay? So if you're a network guy, you probably already know what a 404 is. We're not going to dig into that. But what I will say is, where you're probably wondering, where does this come from? If you looked in the function that we just wrote, you will see that we're doing a raise exception. So this is where that error is coming from. We're doing our own custom error handling. It's pretty cool stuff. So now we have two functions, and we have the first function which works with handling any of the response code errors, and then we have the second one which ties in the first one, which is connecting to the API and pulling that data. There is one other thing in this function that we have to add, which we didn't add before, which is return, and then the response object. So for now, we're not going to wrap this in pretty print because we want to keep it raw, and then when we call it, we can, really do what we want with it. But now that we have that, and now that you've seen this, we are finally going to take this and we're going to run it and pass that data into our response. So now let's finish this up. We technically don't need a function for the last piece here because, well, this isn't a full piece of code yet. It's not completely mature. We are working on getting it to that point. I think in the next couple of videos we'll be at a point to where we can just run this once and then we have a nice little setup. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those commands that we learned from the first video and we're going to pass them in here. So the first thing that you want to do is we're going to have a variable assigned to our function. Oops. And we are going to add our settings. Okay. And now we have the output. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for result in R results. And again, if you didn't watch the first video, this is where all this code comes from. So we're gonna set a variable device to name. We're gonna set the IPv4. Remember that we had to, if there's no IPv4 assigned, then we need a conditional setup so that we don't get any errors raised, unnecessary errors. And honestly, it would actually be good for every data structure in the API response if there's a possibility of it not being a dictionary because there's no input in it, then it would actually be good to put these conditionals in for each of those desired fields. But we're not focused on that because we're just trying to build off of what we started with. We don't want to go too far down the weeds. We're going to build off of a foundation, and then as we move along, it becomes more apparent where this code comes from, and then you see it as it builds, as it manifests into a greater size. So then we're going to say site equals result dot get site dot get name. Finally, we're going to pretty print it. Device name, device management IP site. The question is, why did we get this error? And the output here is going to tell you exactly where your problem is, and it gives you a type error. So the answer is that this right here is your problem. The type is wrong. This is not a dictionary. If I say type R, it's a string. So why did this come up in the first place? If you go back to the function connect to API, what you will notice is r.text is the one that's returned. The thing is, r.text is a string object. It's not a dictionary object. It looks like a dictionary, but it's not a dictionary. You want to know the difference. That's why in the first lesson I showed you the importance of knowing the different types of data. It's very important to know. So instead what you do is you say .json. And then we will make the API call. We will see what type it is now. And it is indeed a dictionary. So now we take our other code, and looky there. We are exactly where we were in the first lesson, except we added in pulling that data from the API instead of already having it. So that is the end of this lesson. Hopefully that was informative. What I'd like to do next time, I'd like to build on top of this. The next thing that we will be doing is we will be working with files. We'll be taking this and putting it into a file. And that's an important part of the mini course. It'll be a piece that will be involved in the whole enchilada. So if there's something in this course that you didn't understand as well as you would like to, let me know. Send me a DM in Twitter or send me an email. You have my email, and then we can go from there. Otherwise, I will see you on one of the next